Hello and welcome to the 19th episode of the Pepper Podcast. For those who are returning, welcome back. And if you are new, the Pepper Podcast covers a wide range of spicy events that occur in our daily lives. Two high school students tackle heated topics through discussion. I am your host, Jay Mehta, and joining me is my co-host, Indy Watanaskunpan. And today's topic will be over fracking and how the extraction of oil and natural gas has left a political, environmental, and socio-economic impact on the U.S. and abroad. The fracking industry supports around 5.6% of the total American employment, but produces approximately 3,400 billion liters of wastewater each year. So that's, I think, 3.4 trillion liters of wastewater each year,
Yeah.
which is a lot of water that we're wasting.
Right.
But at the same time, it's contributing to a lot of American employment. So it's a really multifaceted issue. And
Right.
the market for fracking will be around $68 billion by 2024. So
Wow.
it's very multifaceted.
Right.
And there's a lot of issues on both sides, of course, because
Yeah.
it's an economic issue, it's a political
hmm
issue. And like I said, in the introduction, it's also environmental. And so on top of that, it's a human health issue. So
Right.
there's a lot of issues that we need to look at, especially from different viewpoints. But Andy, if you want to get into really what fracking is, I think that's a good
Yeah.
start.
I'm happy to. So, fracking is short for hydraulic fracturing. It's an efficient way for energy companies to extract gas and oil from rock that's deep underground. It's usually like shale
Hmm.
deposits, right? And so, what these companies do is they have hundreds of trucks go to the say the fracking site because they need to build the drill, build the rig, bring the water, all the stuff. So they build this huge rig. It's like it goes into the sky. It's this drill, and this drill drills down hundreds of meters down,
Hmm.
and then when it reaches a certain point, it goes turns it makes a 90-degree turn and goes straight and keeps going horizontal until it hits whatever the shale, where the shale, the natural gas is.
Hmm.
And then on the ends of these drills are these like pokey hole things.
Yeah.
And so they'll extend from the drill bit and then like as it brings the drill back up, it pokes holes in the shale. And so that kind of like makes the natural gas or the oil seep through so it gets more of that surface area. And then after they've extracted the drill and they've made the hole, they'll blast trillions and trillions of gallons of water into the hole to their break down all the shale to extract the natural gas,
Yeah.
and that's how they get that energy.
Yeah. And those fractures is where
Right.
fracking gets its name from. But I guess the main items that are received from fracking is of course crude oil and natural gas, which is where we get a lot of
Right.
our natural gas from. And typically in the United States, this happens in several regions. Mainly, they're centered up northeast, in the northeast United States, but they're centered around tons of places in Colorado, California,
Right.
New Mexico, Oklahoma, North Dakota, and then a little bit of a few Midwestern states as well. But
Right.
they are mainly in the northeastern region. And
Mhm.
I think a big political topic a few years ago was in Pennsylvania, which was a battleground state, and so the topic of fracking was very controversial in that area because
Right.
fracking provided a lot of jobs, but of course harmed the environment, and so
Right.
that's where we really get main issues from, especially in the United States. But just to keep in mind, like the United States is not the only country that fracks. I believe there are
Yeah.
four countries that frack, and I think it's the
Yeah.
United States, China, Argentina, and I believe one more. I'm not too sure. But I know,
Mexico?
I think it might be Mexico. I can
Yeah.
look up on that. But yes, fracking is not just done in the United States, but it's not really done in a whole lot of other countries because of
Right.
the
Right.
requirements, right? You need to have
Yeah.
shale, you need to have proper like the I guess the ground has to properly
Mhm.
uh, be structured in a certain way and of sedimentary rock and shale that
Right. Right.
allows for the the conditions for natural gas to seep through
Right.
and oil to be created.
Right.
So it's hard to get and extract a lot of this material, especially in areas that are not very rich
Right, right.
in that, I guess, aspect. But I guess we can talk about some pros and cons. I guess we can start because there are so many parts to this. Like we said, we can start off with environmental, which is a big topic of it.
Right,
So
right, right.
fracking, as we said in the introduction, produces a lot of water waste, and as much as several million gallons of water may be used to frack a single well. And
Right,
on top of that, methane can be like leaked accidentally, and
right.
methane is released in the process of fracking. And
Hmm.
so there are also other issues, which deal with, especially in areas that are not cleaned up well. And of course, Superfund and other legislation has fixed this. But
Hmm.
before, fracking operations were not properly cleaned up and
Right.
dismantled, which led to issues within, I guess like foundation wise, and then also there are holes in the area, and there are also just other issues that have affected the general area of the fracking site,
Right,
um,
right.
through pollution, noise pollution as well is a big one.
Yes, yes.
And then on top of that, I guess the shale. And once the shale is fracked and everything's released,
Hmm.
some of that can be maybe contaminated into the water supply,
Yes,
and
yes.
so there's a lot of issues surrounding it environmentally.
Right,
But a
right.
big, I guess the main issue is, of course, the water usage, and specifically because we talked about water. This is the first time I think I'm gonna say we talked about water in a previous episode.
Right, right.
Not an episode for a future time, but in a previous episode we talked about water and how we are not really we're running out of water supplies, especially
Right,
clean water that is safe to drink, groundwater, and
right.
and fresh water, of course. And so some of that water is being used to frack, and that is a big issue because why use that water, to frack when I can drink that? And there are
Hmm.
also, on top of that, other countries that, or sorry, there are other uses for energy production that
Right.
differ from just fracking. And going back to
Yeah.
the countries, it's the United States, Canada, China, and Argentina.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with what you said about how it's controversial, fracking.
Hmm.
Especially in recent years, it's seen more pushback from the general public.
Yeah.
While it is true that fracking produces 60% of about 60% of American crude oil,
Yeah.
and and prices for electricity would be about 31% more than it would be without fracking. There
Hmm.
are a lot of adverse effects people have been looking into to consider whether this alternative for getting energy is a sustainable and effective alternative. And as you said, like environmental impacts is a big one because as we know, it can't in the hydraulic fracturing liquid, the water, it's not just pure water, right? It's not just fresh water or salt water. It's water with so many chemicals, hundreds of chemicals
Yeah.
inside. And these chemicals, as you said, can leak into and contaminate the water sources underground and get into water sources for like livestock, for wells, natural waters, rivers, lakes, ponds, stuff like that.
Hmm.
Right. And there have been instances where people, like, I don't know if you've seen on YouTube, where people like can literally light their tap water on
Yeah.
fire
Yeah.
because the natural gas leaks into that, and like they get sick from being like consuming that water. And I've seen it comes out murky and disgusting,
Hmm.
and right. And there's always going to be a risk when extracting energy, and this is the risk that fracking has. It can contaminate native waters. It can also contaminate the air around where the produce water, which is what they like to call it, the product water.
Yeah.
It's basically the water that's extracted from after drilling and set aside to dispose of the hazardous material responsibly. But it's really difficult to do that because what a lot of these companies do, especially when there's no strict regulation, is they'll literally have them in like giant basins of water and just leave them and sit. and this it's super toxic, and this evaporates into the sky. It causes acid rain. It
Hmm.
causes like literally clouds of pollution over entire towns. Like I believe there are these things. They're like these storage containers where it may look unassuming, but sometimes they're next to schools or houses. And if you take an infrared camera and look at it, you can see all the like the pollution and all the like chemicals radiating off of it and steaming off of it and gets in that air, and it causes all these problems. But as we mentioned before, it's really hard to come up with a solid stance when it comes to fracking because it provides so many benefits to our economy and provides so much energy to the US that it's easy to overlook these catastrophic kind of environmental issues.
Yeah, I get you. But I think it's funny that you mentioned that about like air pollution, which is a little strange because um, the main thing that's contributing to acid rain are what's called nitrogen oxides, NOxes, and sulfur oxides, which are SOxes. And so those are actually decreased with fracking use. Statistics show, and that with more fracking that is created, the amount of crude oil that is used is less because of natural gas. And so, although of course we are contributing to more air pollution, we are reducing the potential air pollution that we are releasing into the atmosphere,
Right.
and because natural gas is the cleanest form of a gas or of hydrocarbon material that we burn.
Yes. Yes.
It does not produce any extra particulates that release in the air. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really clean for our environment. And so
Right.
with fracking, we've actually seen a decrease in the amount of particulates that we're releasing, heavy metals that we're releasing, and NOxes and
Right.
SOxes. And so it is helpful in Pennsylvania where this is an issue. It is helpful that we are fracking with and we're using natural gas instead of crude
Right.
oil and things like that. Even though it does release crude oil, like fracking is used to extract crude oil, natural
Yeah.
gas is a big proponent that helps. Um, I guess the idea of reducing particulates and other matter. But that does not shy away from the fact that it does release methane. It does
Right.
extract crude oil, which do contribute to the particulates, climate change with methane, and of course, a lot
Right.
of global warming potential. But just to throw that out there, it does. And another, I guess, a pro part of this is that fracking and using natural gas as an alternative is helpful for the environment as opposed to using crude oil or
Right.
petroleum. And
Right.
so we're seeing decreases in NOxes and SOx production or release. And so it's a little bit of a multifaceted issue again. But like you said, in Pennsylvania, like there are videos of you, like you said, of people that can light their water on fire because there's so much methane in there. And so that's obviously not good because,
Right.
just having water that is, undrinkable is not something that is very well regulated in
Yes.
I guess, the areas that have fracking in them. And so another issue that pertains to our local area is in Tennessee, the Chattanooga Shale is a place where fracking
Yeah.
happens.
Yes.
And so there is like Tennessee created rules, with fracking, and the rules are a little bit controversial because they don't require drillers to test wells or notify neighbors unless they pump in more than 200,000 gallons of water. And so it's not very like helpful because regulators have acknowledged that fracking most wells in Tennessee only takes
Yeah.
about 175,000 gallons of water. And so
Oh.
this loophole allows for some wells to not be reported and neighbors to not be notified of the fracking that is taking place. And so it's not like helping out the local area and is not
Right.
notifying them of the potential harm that could have caused to public human health and also just other environmental health in the area.
Right. And I think it's important to be aware that the Energy Policy Act, which provided exemptions for the oil and gas industries to extract energy and like gas and oil through this way was the exemption was passed in 2005 by George W. Bush. So a lot of companies have defaulted on that legislation to be able to expand the amount of fracking sites. I believe it grew from about, hold on, let me find this. 26,000 natural gas fracking wells in 2000 to over 300,000 in 2015, which is probably more in 2022 because that's 7 years old. But as you can see, fracking is becoming more popular, but also more controversial
Yeah.
as time goes on.
Yeah. And so we're presenting with this issue, right? Because
Right.
no matter how we get our energy, we are going to contribute to global warming potential in some way, which is very
Right,
unfortunate,
right.
but we can't really do anything about it. And so
Yeah.
either nuclear is really the only one, but nuclear can also cause issues with, what if a like nuclear reactor like overheats or explodes, and that can cause issues with increasing temperatures with near the
Yeah.
water sources that they're with, and then also the energy used to cool down the systems also require fossil fuels to be burned. But fracking reduces carbon dioxide emissions, which is a big
Right.
part of the kind of like idea behind the pros and cons of it, because the main issue with carbon dioxide is it doesn't have a super high global warming potential, but
Right,
it
right.
stays in the atmosphere for a while, for a bit of time. I don't know the exact time, but I can search it up in a second. But the issue with methane is that it has a higher, or I guess another aspect of it is that methane has a higher global warming potential, but stays
Right,
in
right.
the environment, in the atmosphere, less time
Yeah.
than carbon dioxide. And so, with, of course, increasing carbon dioxide emissions, we are seeing an uptick in, global warming potential just by the sheer amount
Mhm.
of it. But either way, you know, we are going to increase our global warming potential regardless. But it's
Right.
lowered energy prices as well, because the steady increased oil and natural gas production will always supply energy. And so it's contributing to the energy security that we have here in the United States.
Right. Right.
So we're creating energy security or decreasing energy prices, which is good for just everyday,
Yeah.
average consumers.
Yeah.
But then we're also reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but at the same time we're increasing methane emissions. We are polluting groundwater resources. We are not, through loopholes,
Right.
notifying the local area about what's going on within our society. And it's just multifaceted, of course.
You're right. No, I completely agree. And this issue is very hard to tackle. All we can do is, provide the facts and just analyze how they're presented. And I think it's also important to move on to talk about some government legislation. I've already mentioned a little bit about how in 2005 the Energy Policy Act was it passed an exemption under George W. Bush,
Hmm.
but it Dick Cheney also plays a very big role in this. Dick Cheney was the vice president to George W. Bush, correct?
Yeah.
And he owned a company called Halliburton, and Halliburton is a very big energy company.
Hmm.
So what they do is they get energy. They're one of the biggest in the U.S. And so it's really hard to say that this exemption was passed with unbiased intentions because, if Dick Cheney is the owner of Halliburton and there are no repercussions if he can, he doesn't want repercussions to drill or for any unsatisfactory effects of getting this energy. So, his Dick Cheney's natural gas force was allowed to inject their chemicals into the water supply with no repercussions.
Mm.
So at the end of the day, they benefit,
Yeah.
and uh, this is because it's a conflict of interest, especially for the Clean Water Act. Was passed. This is also under the Energy Policy Act. So the Clean Water Act falls under that, and a lot of there's been a lot of debate amongst Congress and just the government in general, with people coming up with various evidences that say, fracking is actually overall good for us, or fracking is overall bad. And if even if we analyze unique, smaller personal anecdotes of people who are affected by fracking in a negative light, you could also look larger and see the people who have benefited as a part of fracking.
Yeah.
Right. And, like one other big issue that we run into when we're discussing if we want to ban fracking or if we want to allow fracking is the amount of jobs fracking provides, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they provide a lot of jobs. L- I believe it's. Do
Like
you
like I
know
said,
the
they
amount?
contribute to 5.6% of
Right, right,
the total American employment.
right.
5.6% of American employment. So you're telling me out of 1,000 people in a room, 56 of them will be like supporting the fracking industry or will be
Yeah,
working for the fracking industry. That's
right,
huge because they contribute to a good portion of our energy, but
right.
they still contribute to so much of the workforce that it's hard to just remove fracking because if fracking was removed, 5.6% of our total American employment would immediately be unemployed.
Yes. And that's something to definitely take into consideration when we're talking about, banning fracking because yes, the evidence does some of the evidence does point to having hazardous effects on the ecosystem, on the environment, on animals, and on people. It also, has various positives. It provides jobs, it provides
Hmm.
cleaner energy,
Hmm.
cheaper energy,
Hmm.
and just it helps our economy go,
Just to
right?
throw that, just to support your argument right there.
Right.
Fracking produces 2/3 of natural gas in the United States and also
Yes.
50% of the nation's oil. So it contributes to a significant portion of the gas that we use today. And a lot of people that have stoves in their house that are gas burner stoves use natural gas in their homes. And so for every single person that requires natural gas, we need a constant supply of it to continue to fuel the American home. And
Yes.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, um, just in juxtaposition to natural gas, they're in New York City, right? They have one of the most intricate water systems, and which is like not polluted by anything, which because it comes from a reservoir of water that they've invested a lot of money into. And it's near upstate New York, and the water kind of runs through, filters itself, and it's a sustainable little environment, but it provides the most water to the most people in the world.
Hmm.
It's like a kind of like an ecosystem where all the water comes from. It's
Hmm.
an aquifer, that's what
Yeah.
it's called. An aquifer where all that water comes from. And it if we're talking about water and the contamination, it's really hard to try to solve this water conflict in the US because New York, it might work for New York, right? Investing a lot of money into some going back to nature and using that as a water filtration system and a source of water may work, but whereas somewhere in like say the red zone, Colorado, right?
Hmm.
It's not going to work because Colorado, it's just different climate, different soil, different environment, and it's just really hard to come up with a concrete answer, which this requires many different solutions if we're talking solutions.
Yeah. But then also on top of, like how you talk about solutions, it's again very multifaceted. And so like a March of 2018 opinion poll found that 55% of respondents believe that the environmental risk of hydraulic fracking or, fracturing outweighs
Yeah.
the economic advantages. But on top, like just like you said about using juxtaposition, natural gas produces around 117 pounds of carbon dioxide compared to 228.6 pounds for anthracite coal,
Right.
161.3 pounds for diesel fuel, and 157.2 pounds for gasoline. So it's very, very clean. And this idea about clean energy is very, very important in our society. And like you
Right.
said, investing a lot of money into these programs may be beneficial for some areas, but for in areas like the red zone, like you said, it's hard to really find like a middle ground in which economically advantage, like it's advantageous, but
Right.
also not environmentally completely destructive because the Colorado River is also drying up on top of that, and it's also being stolen from like the I guess the route of the Colorado River
Right.
is now changing, um,
Yes.
and
It's
so
diverted.
it's being diverted, and so
Yeah.
the water supply is decreasing, and on top of that, more pollution and groundwater, you know, pollution
Yeah.
and freshwater pollution will contribute to just the mix, and so it's hard to really find this whole middle ground between things, and it gets
Right. Right.
repetitive. It gets repetitive with not finding a like a middle ground, but
Yeah. But that's the importance of developing your own opinions, doing your research,
yeah.
and just getting educated,
Yeah.
right?
But then another issue with fracking is that it creates seismic activity. And we don't talk a whole lot about this, but
Yeah.
just the injection of recovered fracking water into underground disposal wells raises, the environmental concern of seismicity. So all frac jobs produce vibrations that can be detected by the sensitive instruments, but sometimes on occasion, larger than usual number of small tremors and even light earthquakes of magnitude 4.0 or higher have been recorded in some areas where shale gas is being developed. So, according to Britannica.com, we are seeing that there is a correlation between fracking and seismic activity in that area,
Yeah.
which makes sense. Obviously, you're pumping excessive amounts of water into the ground to break it and fracture it, right? So that's going to cause some seismic activity. And so a more serious threat, though, is that the underground disposal of this huge quantity of drilling in the fracking fluid will
Mhm.
alter the pressure balance or even lubricate the existing faults that are already liable to slip. So in some areas of known fault lines, the underground disposal has been banned to just prevent that from happening. But it could cause further imbalances between fault lines, which will cause earthquakes. So of course it depends on the area, especially where the fault lines are. But contributing to increased fault line use and increased seismic activity is another environmental impact that we're having.
Yeah. And just to kind of antithesize what you were saying about uh, the the threat that fracturing could cause earthquakes, just to show that this is such a a multifaceted, as you said, issue. The EPA, the administrator for the EPA, Lisa Jackson, testified before Congress in May 2011 and stated that fracking has not caused any proven issues of contamination with water supplies. So
Hmm.
the data could show that fracking doesn't actually cause all this water contamination, but even the EPA has come out to say that it hasn't, which take that as you will. But
There's a reason behind that, and I can explain that if whenever
go
you're
ahead,
done.
go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
So we haven't talked about is non-point and point sources of pollution, and
Right.
so the difference is point sources of pollution. You can easily identify where this comes from. If you see me, purposely pouring oil in water, you can obviously tell that that's a point source of pollution. Like you can see
Yes.
me, obviously doing that. But there are
Yeah.
non-point sources of pollution, like agricultural methane production. Not methane production, but fertilizer production that goes into water and creates algal blooms. There is, fracking release. As long as it's dispersed, it's hard to find as like a direct point,
Yes.
of
Right.
source of
Of where the pollution comes from.
exactly. So it's
Yeah.
hard
Yeah.
to find statistics that back up a point source pollution. So because of that, it's hard to pinpoint it on,
Right.
okay, so fracking does this. It's hard to find a direct answer for it, but the best you can do is find a slight correlation. And so there is a correlation between fracking and groundwater, sorry, not groundwater, but freshwater contamination. But
Mhm.
of course, as long as the whole fracking process is very safely measured and maintained, and it's looked
Right.
over very well and is very secure, it should
Mhm.
be good in most areas. But again, there are times where things slip and bad things
Yeah.
happen and it does
Mistakes
contaminate.
always happen, right?
Yeah. And so I
Yeah.
think in one area, I think like 100,000 gallons of fracking water went into the air, into the water supplies, and contaminated a lot of the
Mhm.
the supplies of water. I think that was in Pennsylvania, but it's hard to find, like this idea of where is it a problem and where is it, helping our environment. But going back to the earthquakes, surprisingly, fracking does not cause earthquakes. Reinjection wells do. And so a big issue is that not the individual fracking, which of course is a problem, but one fracking well can be fracked up to 20 times. And so in these 20 times, the continued fracking of this one source causes more and more breakage of that area. And so when that breakage increases and increases and increases, it's creating more seismic activity, which leads to more earthquakes. And so it's hard to find like when, more it was hard to like document exactly when more seismic activity was created when, fracking occurred, because
Right.
there's no, like I said, definitive answer. It's more of a slight correlation between the data, which is a little
Right.
infuriating, of course, but take of it as you will, I guess. But with if you see a slight correlation between fracking and earthquakes, I think it's more so of a true answer than it is not.
Right. 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 Yeah, and I completely agree. It's a very controversial
Hmm.
topic
Yeah,
that requires a lot more research. Um, so what we recommend you do is definitely do your research
yeah,
because that's how you get educated, that's how you form your own opinions. And yeah, I think it's especially important for fracking,
yeah.
right?
Because it can go both ways, right? You can
Right,
argue
right.
for both sides, and that's why it's such a big issue and why it's been
Hmm.
politicized today in this
Exactly,
environment. And
exactly.
especially in the United States, I think fracking was a big issue, was a big topic within political debates when
Yeah.
running for the presidency. And because fracking contributes to so many jobs, it contributes to a lot of the market. Um, which is, like I said, 68 billion by 2024. It
Hmm.
is contributing to the job market. It is contributing to the amount of natural gas that it's producing. 2/3 is a lot, but it's also wasting a lot of water.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
it's leaking methane. Around 3.7% of
Right.
methane is leaked into the atmosphere during a fracking
Yes.
process. And then by 2025, an estimated health damages caused by methane leakage during fracking would cost 13 to 29 billion each year. So
Right.
there comes a point where it becomes, when is it environmentally and economically responsible for us to,
Right.
I guess, continue fracking or
Continue
stop
for
fracking?
yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
I agree. And with that, our discussion comes to an end. We thank you for listening and hope you'll stay tuned for future episodes. Don't forget to follow the Pepper Podcast on Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. Thank you.
Thank you.